today. My name is Kim Stevens, and I'm Program Manager at North American Council on Adoptable Children. And I will let my co-presenter introduce herself.
Hello, everyone. My name is Kayla Van Dyke. I'm the Youth Engagement Coordinator here at NACAC. My personal connection to the work is that I actually grew up in Minnesota's foster care system. I spent 11 years in the system here, and I've been working in advocacy in a number of different coordinator positions with the foster care and adoption community for about 7 years now. I have a bit of a cold right now, so in case you hear me sniffling or coughing, I apologize for that.
Thanks, Kayla. And to let folks know a little bit about my personal experience, my husband and I are the adoptive parents of 4 children who are now adults from the Massachusetts foster care system. We also have 2 birth sons, and I've been doing work since about 1988, 89, helping parents and youth learn how to use their stories to help promote advocacy efforts. The first slide I'm going to go to is just to tell you a little bit about how the webinar works and what to know about. Everybody will be listening on mute. You won't be able to be speaking, but we do want to hear what you have to say. So if you have questions, if you have comments you want to make, you'll see over on the side of your screen that there is a place that has both a chat button and a question button. You also can raise your hand to grab my attention. If a hand is raised, it will pop up on my screen, so I will know that. And I know that Kayla and I will take a moment about halfway through to see if there are questions at that point, and then we hopefully will have time at the end for questions, but you always can get in touch with either one of us after the presentation is done.
Awesome. Sorry, that's me clearing my voice again. Now, for some of you, a lot of this might seem a bit redundant, but for those of you who are maybe a little bit new to advocacy or who tend to spearhead projects independently, engaging others in your work might seem impossibly challenging. After all, the more people we bring in on a project, the more likely it is that one or more factors will be out of our control. Despite this, many of the challenges of collaborating with others, advocacy requires a team of people with different experiences, expertise, skills, and perspectives. And having this spread of experiences is going to make you likely to connect with your audience and imprint your message on the people capable of making that change. The first time I was actually asked to share my story, I was 18, and I was invited to testify in front of the Senate Help Committee. And the one thing that I was really struck by during this experience was the difference between how my personal testimony was received as compared to the other experts on the panel, many of which who are professionals, came very prepared with briefcases and numbers. And again, not only do individuals with lived experiences have a lot to contribute in regards to the discussion around systems change and solutions, they also put a face to the issues being discussed. It's this personal element that allows change makers, such as legislators, to feel a personal connection to the cause that you're trying to bring attention to. Another element that's important when considering using a personal story is whether or not you can pair it with data and numbers to show a larger trend. We want to highlight that our story is part of a larger trend and not just isolated to us as individuals, that these are actually systematic issues that can be addressed with strategic changes. I mentioned before a little bit about my own experience testifying, and I had such a huge response from just being able to share details of my personal experience in collaboration with some of the data trends that I had. I received a lot more attention and questions, and again, this really just highlights the importance of getting people with these personal experiences to collaborate with you on the changes that you're trying to make. All right, 2 ways this can happen. You want to make sure that you're engaging advocates with stories relevant to the issues that you're attempting to address. For instance, you wouldn't necessarily have a same-race adoptive parent speak on the issues of transracial adoption. Another thing to steer clear from in this process is the idea of a gold star advocate. And this is essentially the idea that sometimes we cherry pick advocates based on their success and not the challenges that they've faced or the insight that they have. Now, cherry picking often does a disservice not only to youth but our advocacy efforts because it promotes the exclusion of youth who've struggled youth and parents who've struggled the most and likely have the greatest insight into the failings of the system. As an adult supporter or leader, it's our responsibility to equip and prepare advocates with the skills they need to share their stories. If you're only engaging advocates with a single type of story, or those who look and respond to you in a particular way, you're going to end up with a very limited perspective on the issues that you're actually hoping to address. So make sure you're looking for personal stories that actually exemplify some of these challenges very directly. Personal stories that might be difficult to engage with, but that ultimately show a much clearer picture of the system. Thank you. That's Newman, our other co-presenter. Kim, I believe this is you.
Sorry, Kayla, I was muting my co-presenter. And apparently he's not being muted. Anyway, so the first thing we have to do as we're preparing to do strategic sharing is to really establish the goals that you have. And I will say that it's important if you're wanting to engage people in doing advocacy work with you, the polite, respectful, and collegial thing to do is to establish those goals together. Don't come up with your own set of goals, your own agenda, and then approach people and ask them to speak about what you've wanted them to speak about. Really sit together with the people that are on your advocacy team and establish those goals as a team and as in a manner of respect and caring for one another. Then you want to think about what messages and who has the messages that are going to relate well to that goal. So that, again, like Kayla said, you don't want to have somebody that's going to share a message that is not on target. You want to be laser focused around what it is that you're getting across. You're going to develop sort of an outline or a bullet point of what the main issues are, the main talking points are. And then we sort of run through that later on in this slide. You'll see, for example, if you're highlighting the need for support services for older children or for children who have extra challenges, these are the various talking points you might use. Children who face a variety of challenges are successfully being raised in families. That's going to combat the thought that some people have that children who have had trauma histories or children who have specific and elevated behavioral or emotional needs can't be in a family, that we can't find families for them, and that's absolutely not true. The second piece that we want to say is that, of course, families are the best place for all children and youth to grow up and to grow old in. It's through relationship that people heal. It's through relationship that people find meaning. And so therefore, it's through the relationship of being in a family that we're going to be helping kids who have had to experience trauma and loss. The next talking point may be that there's a family for every child. And when you think about that particular talking point, you want to be very thoughtful about how you are identifying family, how your speakers are identifying and exemplifying what family looks like. Because in fact, there are all kinds of ways that families can look. And for every child and youth, there might be a different kind of a family that's right for them. There could be a same-sex couple that is the best family for a certain child. Maybe it's someone who's older, who's had experience raising kids. Maybe it's a single parent. And maybe it's a group of adults that together have made a family commitment. But really thinking about how do you get the message across that there are lots of different kinds of families and not just one family is the right family. And finally, the last talking point you might come up with for this particular topic is that the families are going to need training and support. We want to make sure that when the kids get into the family that's going to raise them and be there for them as they grow old, that that family has all the resources, all the knowledge, and all the support necessary to do the best job for that child. After all, we've made a promise to the child, and we want to keep it. Kayla,
All right.
take this away.
What was that?
I was just cueing you.
Okay, thank you. So I'm going to give you a few tips for engaging young people in establishing your goals and involving young people in the process of leadership can actually be really challenging for a number of reasons. For one, they're very impressionable, and so if you are especially loud with a particular agenda that you're trying to push or that you're passionate about or that you even think the group might really latch onto, oftentimes young people who are not accustomed to a leadership role might just kind of latch onto that at the expense of their own ideas. You really want to make sure that when you're bringing young people into a leadership position, into a position in which they're giving feedback, that you're doing so authentically, that you're promoting their own voice, that you're giving them a platform to kind of communicate the issues that are specific to their own story and building on that, as opposed to kind of just implementing some of the agenda items you'd like to see or kind of coaxing them along under the guise of authentic youth engagement. And so an example that we have here is the idea of advocating for normalcy, which is definitely something that's had much more of a conversation within the last few years. And in this case, some of your talking points might include a young person that wasn't able to join a sports team in high school because of out-of-state travel, somebody wanting to have a sleepover with a best friend but wasn't allowed. And in those of us in foster care, and essentially just participating in a number of different activities that for other youth would have been a normal experience in their development, such as prom, learning how to drive. And again, the idea is to kind of vet the conversations with young people to kind of tease these things out instead of leading them down an avenue of conversation in which you might be inserting some of your own ideas at the expense of the experience of these young people. And a good kind of tip for that essentially is to engage them in a variety of different contexts in which they're not put on the spot. Kind of use different activities in which you can have a conversation with young people and build on what they're saying, as opposed to potentially laying the tracks for them to follow the example that you're trying to insinuate.
And one more caveat that I would say for the adult supporters who may be engaging youth in some of these strategic sharing or speak out advocacy efforts is to make sure that you are never asking youth to speak on behalf of an adult agenda. One of the examples that I can share with you is that many years ago, when I was facilitating a youth speak out team in Massachusetts, I had a group come to me and ask if we could get some youth who would be able to speak about the fact that adoptive parents and foster parents needed to have a higher rate of stipend or a higher rate of adoption assistance payment. And I quite simply said that there was no way in the world that I could ever ask young people to advocate and speak out on behalf of higher rates of pay for people who were caring for them. And that's not to say that I don't understand the need. It's not to say that I don't realize that foster and adoptive parents use those funds in order to meet the needs of their children. But looking at it from a youth point of view, there's already a concern, a fear that the only adults in a young person's life who has experienced care, that the only adults that are still there are adults that are paid to be there. We certainly don't want to exacerbate that belief with kids by asking them to speak out on behalf of our agenda. So the next thing you want to do once you've got your goals, once you've got your outline of your messages, your sort of draft bullet points, you want to start brainstorming who could be the best messengers. What types of families can get that story across? Of particular use when you're thinking about an audience that might not believe that kids with serious challenging behaviors can grow up in families. Obviously, you're going to want to find families who are successfully raising, parenting children that have challenging behaviors. If we are talking to folks that believe that children who have extreme medical needs, so for example, a child that might be on a G tube for feeding, or a child who may have cerebral palsy and is confined to a wheelchair, we're going to find families that are successfully and happily parenting children in those situations. For young people who have experienced foster care or adoption, we again want to think about what is the message, what's the story that we want to get across, and who are the young people that can get that story across. You're going to start soliciting stories, and when we're doing this at NACAC, we usually do sort of a broad request, a broad sweep. We'll think about who are the families that we already know, who are the young people that we already know. We will get in touch with them, tell them what it is that we're trying to influence. And we will also think about who are the policymakers that we need to influence. So, for example, if there is a local, if you're from California and you live in a certain county, and there is a county rule or a county policy that you need to change, you want to make sure that your speakers or your writers are coming from that county. If there's something happening in Minnesota that's really important, I don't want to ask someone from Rhode Island to speak about that because it's not going to be relatable. We want to ask other people for recommendations. And some of the best folks that you can talk to get recommendations are those people that are on the inside who may not be able to advocate themselves, but you know are on your side, our angels who are lurking in the wings of either the Department of Human Services or in the legislative body, who can't necessarily make the change or speak out themselves, but can give us some clues about what they need to hear. And then certainly you want to have a diversity. And when I say diversity, I mean broad, wide, deep of different stories and storytellers. Then you choose the one or two or three or four people who's best able to convey the message, best able to show the diversity of the issues. And you want to make sure that each one of your speakers tells a different piece of the puzzle. Now, just because you're not going to have 10 or 15 speakers doesn't mean that you can't also include their voices. You can include them through pictures, poetry, letters, all kinds of written material and handouts that you can also share with them.
All right, partnering with your advocates. Now, the very first thing I want to say about this part of your work is that it needs to start with respect. And again, sometimes there can be experiences and age differences within the advocates that you're trying to engage, whether it be young people or adults. And one thing I really want you guys to consider when you're explaining to an advocate what their role will be is what level of engagement that you'd like to use. And again, not all involvement looks the same. And depending on the context, experience, and availability of your advocates, you might want to delegate or invite them to take on more or less responsibility. Another element of this to consider when you're engaging advocates is also personal empowerment. While strictly adult or organizationally led advocacy can sometimes be less complicated than engaging young people or parents in leadership roles, it can sometimes limit the momentum of your group and cause you to ignore necessary considerations and directions from the people that know the issues the best. And again, going back to this idea of respect when partnering with advocates, I want you to consider what level of engagement you are hoping to achieve with this person before you even engage in inviting them to the opportunity. There's a really great resource called the Ladder of Youth Engagement. Obviously, it's specific to young people, but I think it applies to pretty much all advocates as well. On the lower rungs of the ladder, you're going to notice the ideas of tokenism, inviting young people or adult supporters to the table as decoration, inviting them to the table without any intention of hearing what they have to say or meaningfully engaging them in the work. And I really want you, to the best of your ability, to avoid doing these things. Engagement means allowing someone to get involved with the process. And again, some of these skills rely on deciding together what their role will be. Again, some advocates want less of a role, mostly maybe, do something in the background, contributing that way. You also want to highlight the avenue to success. Nobody comes into advocacy with all the skills that they need. And as the organizer, as the facilitator, it's your role to essentially create an environment in which these advocates can thrive. And again, you want to also help them to be able to strategically share. And we're going to go over some of these skills later in the PowerPoint as well. But essentially, it's the idea that by engaging parents and young people in the process of advocacy, that we do so in such a way that they are prepared for the consequences of sharing their story, like on their own lives, as well as on the lives of the other people involved within that story. And some of those skills essentially come with the ideas of not necessarily taking for granted that other people might understand the culture of foster care. and some of the skills that they need not to get bogged down by details or disclosing too much. And again, these are issues faced by many advocates despite having a lot of experience. All right, strategic sharing. So strategic sharing was actually developed by Foster Club and the former National Resource Center for Youth Development. It kind of came out because of necessities. These organizations were kind of the forerunners of engaging young people and being involved in their work. And one of the things that they began noticing was that their young people were having challenges. And these challenges were specific to oversharing to the point in which they were becoming too emotionally charged from what they were sharing. Some of these consequences include sharing details of other people's stories, which then damage their relationship with these people. There was a young advocate, young at one point at least, named Dan Knapp, and he was actually invited to share his story with people. However, during that interview process, he ended up disclosing a number of details about his sister. His sister later went on to read some of these details and became really upset. There's quite a bit in there that she had not communicated with anybody else in her life, and to essentially read it being posted on a major publication without her consent caused a huge rift in their relationship. And it was actually one of the incentives that Celeste Bodner, the creator of Foster Club, actually had in kind of partnering with the NRYCD and creating this manual. And so essentially, if you're using strategic sharing well, and again, this is a training found in many varieties online, in digital print, or you can request it from us in person. Essentially, it prepares an advocate to share their story in a way that is effective, will not trigger or alienate an audience unnecessarily, and protects the privacy of the individuals being discussed, as well as the emotional well-being of the person communicating. And we're going to take the opportunity to go over some of these really basic skills in a very short and dirty kind of way. This is a training that typically takes about 2 hours. Involves quite a bit of activity between young people and adults. And again, this is a training that was developed for young people, but the skills are transferable for all advocates. Given that there's often an emotional incentive to sharing your story, even the most seasoned advocates or adults that should, quote unquote, know better, can sometimes get wrapped up in oversharing and potentially not being considerate of the details or the audience that they have when they are communicating the details of their story or the details of someone else's story. All right. So the first skill that we're going to talk about is sharing circles. And again, this one looks pretty basic. At the center of this circle is the idea that you are the most in the know of your story. You have the most intimate knowledge of yourself. You share most things with yourself. And that darkness in the center is kind of illuminating that emotional intensity. And outwards, you're going to see friends and family. That's the circle closest to you. Essentially, it is a way of teaching young people and adult advocates to consider the audience that they have when they're defining boundaries for sharing, and also in the context of understanding those relationships. I was actually, can you go back? Sorry. So to this point, I was actually on a panel about 2 years ago, and I'm pretty familiar with sharing my story. And I had a great relationship with the facilitator and also many of the people on the panel. And one of the reasons that we really do kind of talk about this idea of the radiating circles that come from sharing our story in advocacy is that sometimes you can be in a context, and often advocacy puts you in this context in which some of the intimate details that you're sharing of your life are actually to people that are in the outer rings of this, strangers and acquaintances, colleagues. So I was on this panel, and again, the relationship that I shared with the facilitator, that I shared with these other members of the panel was, really close. We were used to having conversations that were a little bit more intimate, that had a little bit more detail than most conversations in advocacy had. And I kind of got tripped up. And I think some of the other panelists also got a little bit tripped up as well. One of us, shared something that was a little bit emotionally antagonizing, and then we kind of snowballed into this pattern of sharing quite a bit. By the end of the panel, I remember getting off of it and just being completely overwhelmed. All these strangers came up to me and started having these conversations with me about very intimate details of my life that, although I was very aware I was sharing, in the moment, I really hadn't considered my real audience. I felt as though I was kind of having this conversation with these people that were in my friends and family circle. However, that conversation was very visible and loud to people in the acquaintance and stranger rings of my life. And again, this is something that we try to shield advocates from by really encouraging them to consider the audience that they're presenting to. We don't necessarily need to give the nitty-gritty emotional details of our life and how we responded to a situation in order to give feedback that is relevant and can make a difference in advocacy.
A couple of tricks that I would add to that are that you can tell the story of a particular problem, incident, challenge by saying there are other people that I know who have told me, right? So one of the examples that I had shared with Kayla when we were preparing was a young man who spoke at a NACAC panel for us many years ago, and he and the other panelists and I had met together the night before. As Kayla demonstrated in her piece, we got to be very close very quickly because we were in a small group of people that were caring, people that were watching out for one another, and people who were being very open and sharing our experiences on a very personal level. Well, this young man then got up in front of an audience of almost 1,000 people and revealed details, very intimate details of a sexual abuse history, and then had to spend the rest of the conference looking at people, listening to people, talking to people who knew things about him that he really wished they hadn't. And one of the things that we talked about afterwards was that you can let people know about those experiences simply by saying, I know that in many cases, a young person who was in a setting like I was may experience, or I've heard from other people, but distance yourself from it personally enough so that you are protecting yourself.
Can you go back 1 second?
Sure
Can I
can.
add one? So, like I mentioned before, strategic sharing as a handout is available in many forms online. They're all pretty similar. They go through some of the skills that we're going to be talking about within the next couple of slides. But one way in which you might teach this particular skill or consideration is by allowing your advocates to, and again, sometimes it sounds a little simple, just literally within each circle kind of describe how much you'd be comfortable with these people knowing about you. So you'd start with yourself, for instance, in the middle. You'd have the people in the room brainstorm, everything you're comfortable having a discussion with yourself about. With mental health, that can be maybe a little bit of a different conversation. And then you go to each of the outer rings and consider details that you'd be comfortable, at least these young people in general, with sharing. So family and friends, what kind of things would be comfortable sharing with? Teachers, acquaintances, coworkers. And although it seems, again, like a kind of something that we should already know, having a really explicit conversation about it sometimes really reinforces the idea within people in a moment's notice if they are put on the spot to be able to kind of pull that consideration up much quicker. Like, oh, I'm talking with a facilitator that I know quite well, but the actual audience is strangers. What do I communicate with strangers? Ideas that promote an agenda. Right? All right. Red light, green light is one of the second most important skills that we teach within strategic sharing. Going back to the idea that not all details of our stories are necessary in advocacy context is the red light, green light training. Now, this is an exercise designed to help and train advocates to consider the amount of detail that is appropriate for the audience that they're sharing with. I like this tool a lot because despite how simple it is, it's something that often pops up in my mind as I reflect on when I'm on the spot. We really want to train this to the point in which it becomes a reflex. On a very simple basis, the green light is something that you could share with anybody, or a green light statement would be something that is very appropriate and direct in the moment of being asked a question. It's something that does not alienate anyone. It's something that fully encompasses the idea that you're trying to communicate, and it doesn't necessarily reveal anything about you that you feel uncomfortable with. This might be as simple as a statement like, I am in foster care, or my name is Kayla, or my interests include any of such things. It's often the bare bones of communication. And again, these statements can be pretty variable depending on the context and also your personal level of comfort in sharing. Yellow light statement is something that we introduce to advocates as something that you might want to pause and reflect on before you actually share. The example statement that we have here is, I live in a group home. Now, if you were on a panel, this might be a very green light statement because it's actually an issue that you're meeting to talk about. However, if you're in a school setting, it could potentially be a yellow light statement, depending on whether or not you're comfortable about answering any follow-up questions. Yellow light statements often inspire questions and further dialogue. And if you're not emotionally comfortable continuing that dialogue, it can easily be something that becomes uncomfortable for you. Yellow light statements also might potentially have information about other people that you are not privileged enough to share. For instance, many young people that are advocates have siblings that have also shared experiences with them. And although you have full entitlement to your own story, it's really important to remember that other people involved in that story might want to retain their privacy and may not want to have the same kind of exposure to their story that you do. In which case, some of those generalized statements, like Kim was giving an example to in the last slide, could be very beneficial to you. And lastly, red light statements. So these are often statements that can alienate an audience, insults, generalizations that are broadly negative. For instance, all foster parents are in it for the money. Although you may personally feel that within your own opinion and experiences, it's the kind of statement that makes it really difficult for potential allies to understand your message, get on board with your message, and be inspired by change. It can be something that is so emotionally difficult for you to engage with that you are not able to continue on with the advocacy that you are doing. For instance, if you're on a panel and someone asks you about the personal, abuse that you have experienced, and you choose to answer that question, if you are too emotional to proceed, or if that emotion that erupted from that moment causes you to stress well after your opportunity to be involved, it's considered a red light statement. Another thing I want people to consider in regards to their comfort in sharing is other people's comfort. We talk about not triggering audience members as well. I've had a number of young people that I've worked with that have been very comfortable with their experiences. They can talk about details of the abuse that they went through and challenges that they faced, almost with a stone-like expression. They don't really feel emotion in regards to it. They're very emotionally detached. However, in describing details of their abuse, their physical abuse, the rape that they experienced, or even just using some of these buzzwords, you can see audience members get triggered to the point of not being able to listen anymore. And so one thing I really like to promote with advocates is the idea of being considerate to the sentiments of your audience as well. Even if you are very comfortable with these details, even if it's something that you have processed and resolved completely, it can be really challenging for you to keep engaging your audience if they are too triggered to proceed. And so really instilling that sensitivity into young people especially is something that I encourage for all of you. Like I mentioned before, there is several activities within the online handouts that you can use to kind of help reinforce this idea. It's essentially just a consideration for the context of where you're sharing and who your audience is and what you personally feel comfortable sharing. And hopefully with enough practice, this becomes instinctual to young people and advocates of all ages. Escape hatch. This is one of my favorite skills, and I think one of the most necessary for as prepared as an advocate can be. Oftentimes, the people that we're engaging with do not have the same level of preparedness. Despite our best planning and intentions, advocates can sometimes be put into the spot to answer a question that is either really uncomfortable or insulting, which is why we also teach these skills. These are essentially just tools used by advocates to either sidestep, redirect, or shut down a question that is making them uncomfortable. Now, the first skill on the list that you'll notice is called the pivot. And again, essentially, this is just going to redirect a subject to be more general. And I think Kim actually gave a really great example of this on sharing circles. If someone were to ask you, for example, what was the abuse like? And if you didn't want to answer that red light question, you might instead make it generalized to the foster care population, make it based on your experiences as an advocate. You know, maybe I've heard a lot of people talk about having experienced abuse is obviously an issue given the lack of really permanent, sustainable foster homes. And in that kind of example, you can see how instead of making it about your story, you can instead kind of make a bigger picture answer that doesn't focus on the details that might be potentially triggering to your emotional state. Next is the idea of challenging an assumption. For example, there was once a question asked on a panel in which a young person was put on the spot to, what did you do to end up in foster care? And again, that is a pretty pointed statement. It doesn't really serve a function other than to put them in a position where they feel accused. And in that case, the young person essentially was like, you know, most young people and many of the young people that I know through my work actually entered foster care through issues of neglect, which is true. And so in that way, you can either redirect, be more general, which that example kind of does, or you can straight up challenge an assumption when a question is not beneficial to the change that you're trying to promote, or is just kind of satiating someone's curiosity. Kim, did you have an example of that one too?
Well, one of the examples that I had shared with Kayla earlier this week was as the person who is the panel facilitator, because oftentimes as a panel facilitator, you're going to have a panelist who says something that, either is triggering the audience or is perhaps not true, or is including an assumption that might not be helpful to your cause. And my favorite example of this was actually a panel that I was facilitating that my daughter Justice was speaking on. At the time, she was 16. My daughter Justice is African American, and her sister and she were adopted together when they were 6 and 7. My husband and I are Caucasian and have two Caucasian birth sons. And she was speaking in front of the entire Massachusetts Adoption Practitioners Conference. Public and private were together. There were about 350 practitioners in the room, including her social worker and her social worker's boss. And Justice shared with the group that she did not know that the family that she was being adopted with or adopted by was white. And that was her opening statement, and she went on to speak. And you can imagine, as the facilitator, I was standing there wanting desperately to say something, but that would have been disrespectful. So I let her finish. I let the next panelist finish. And when it became time for questions and answers, I begged the audience's indulgence. And I said, I'd like to go back to one of our panelists for just a minute. And I asked Justice, would you mind if I shared with folks, because everybody in the room knew that we were mother and daughter. And I said, would you mind if I shared my recollection of that time? And she said, no, that's fine. You can definitely do that. And I said, well, here's the factual, not necessarily true, but the factual piece around Justice and her sister coming to our family. She was 7, and she did receive a book that had pictures of all of us. Her social worker talked with her about the idea of being in our family. And in fact, we had met both Justice and her sister on several occasions and had interactions with them. And they knew what was, they knew after a couple of times what was happening. We'd had visits and everything. And I said, but the thing is, and all of us need to remember this, this is a really good lesson for us, that a 7-year-old doesn't think about the color of the skin of the family that they are finally going to be able to grow up and grow old in. But a 16-year-old does. And so we have to really be thoughtful about how often and in how many ways we inform kids and we engage them in the process. And we also need to remember to go back and revisit those issues at developmental times in their life. And I think it was a really great learning experience for all of us that could have, without the pivot, left people in the room with a really negative and skewed vision.
That's perfect. Thank you, Kim. Lastly, I want to talk about GUARD. And I know I've mentioned this idea before, But oftentimes, people with personal stories to tell, especially young people and parents who have felt like their voice has been ignored for so long, frustrated adoptive parents who have been really struggling to receive services, foster youth that have never really been able to give input on the direction of their lives. Being invited to the table is a huge privilege, and oftentimes it creates an emotional incentive to sharing that can inspire them to put themselves in a position in which they are more vulnerable than they would normally be comfortable with. And so again, GUARD is something that I really like to teach these young people and adult supporters so that they know it's available to them. A lot of times you can be asked a question that might be really simple. I was on a panel once and I was asked, do you still have a relationship with your siblings? I have a very large family. I have about 10 siblings at this point. And it wasn't an inappropriate question. It was a question that very much served the purpose of the panel, but I remember just breaking down and crying. And I kept trying to kind of spit out an answer to this. I kept trying to redeem the question because, again, it wasn't inappropriate. I felt as though I had to honor the person that had been willing to engage me on my story. And I just really couldn't do it. And in situations like this and in many others, we really want to enforce the idea with our advocates that it's okay to communicate that you don't feel comfortable answering a question. Might be because the question is insulting. It might be because the question is only serving to satiate their curiosity. It might simply be because you don't have the emotional ability to complete that conversation. On another note, another form of GUARD, instead of declining to answer the question, would be to redirect to have that conversation in private. There have been several questions, and again, they usually come from young people trying to engage with me when I'm on a panel. Some of those questions are a little inappropriate, but given that I have a personal connection to these young people, I have sometimes offered to have that question and have that conversation in private. If it's around specific issues of abuse or how I've coped with mental health issues, and some of those details are a little bit potentially too triggering for the audience, I will sometimes invite a smaller group of people to have that conversation with me instead. And again, some of those topics might be related to suicide, various forms of abuse. And in those situations, I didn't really want to say no to those young people, even though I had the power. I just wanted to redirect the conversation to be a little bit more private so that I didn't end up, again, alienating some potential allies by, having a conversation that was too difficult for them to be receiving of and processing of at the time. And this really goes to our comfort meter. Now, this is going to be a skill that's not necessarily taught within the normal framework of strategic sharing. It's something that I've kind of just developed as a framework for my facilitation of youth trainings. And it's a set of really basic skills. I really don't like to go into any kind of training or engagement with people that have personal experience without building a relationship with them first. I usually try to have some sort of check-in or meeting with them so that they know my name, that we're able to introduce ourselves prior to the engagement, whether it be a panel or a training. Just making sure that they know your face, they feel comfortable and safe with you is going to be really important. And so one of the things I do to kind of promote this idea, it's called the emotional check-in. And sometimes you have young people and parents that are very aware of the topics that they're uncomfortable talking about. My foster mother does a bit of advocacy herself, and one of the topics that she has a lot of challenge with is around the idea of what to do when the child you're planning to adopt, is replaced with a biological parent. And, she is aware of her own emotions well enough to say, I'm not actually comfortable talking about that. And so she will decline, and she'll communicate that with facilitators prior to even being asked so that she avoids kind of any of that emotional triggering. Likewise, sometimes I will allow people to have an idea of some of the issues that are a little bit more sensitive for myself. And again, for young people and for parents that have that understanding of themselves, just having a quick conversation with them before you bring them into whatever opportunity you're inviting them to, just to say like, hey, is there anything I should steer clear of? It's going to go a long way in making sure that they are comfortable enough to continue engaging throughout the event. And essentially having this conversation more so than just the surface level interaction does a lot to build trust between you and the advocate themselves. And that's going to be really important in the quality of engagement that you're going to have. Their ability to negotiate with you and bring up different issues around their comfort or their willingness to participate is going to be based on the relationship that they build with you. So much of what we're doing in child welfare advocacy revolves around issues where people have been hurt by the system when they've been let down, and so that relationship, much more so than other arenas of advocacy, is really important to build in this context. And lastly, for people that are a little less familiar with their comfort levels around certain topics, maybe people that are just kind of coming into advocacy, one of the things that I would recommend you to do, and you can do this a variety of ways with different props, but I call it the comfort meter. It's a way of screening topics and their comfort with them. I will have young people or other advocates hold a bar or hold their hands as if they're a bar in front of their face, and then I will ask them potential questions, and then depending on their emotional reaction to those questions, whether or not they feel as though they could respond, they will either lower, raise their arms, or keep them where they are. Sometimes I will allow young people and other advocates to kind of give a practice answer just on a few generalized topics. More so than even if they just kind of wade through their own emotions, giving them an opportunity to respond to something will give them a much better idea about how they might react in the moment if they are put on the spot with a question like that.
So I want to talk about some specific tips for parents when they're doing advocacy work. And I think above all, just to remember that your child's story belongs to them. So if you are going to be sharing, you need to be sharing carefully and respectfully, and above all, with your children's permission. So my children know that I work in this field, and I have asked each of them separately and privately about whether or not I can share parts of their story, what parts of their story they feel comfortable with me sharing, and under what circumstances. And so if any of you have ever heard me speak, um, even in this webinar, I've shared a bit about a couple of my children. That is always with their permission and with their understanding. It's really, really important for us to make the points that we have to make, but without making those points on our children's behalf. They do not, we don't own their story. The other thing is we really have to think about how we're talking about our kids in terms of people, individuals who have strengths. And even as we speak about their challenges, helping people to understand that even the challenges that they have in terms of being in the world, acting a certain way in school or in the community or in our family, those challenging behaviors are a result of very, very skillful survival skills that they have put together under adverse circumstances, whether they have suffered from neglect or abuse, even just the experience of being in foster care and moving from place to place, our children end up developing survival skills that essentially allow them to continue to live. And I think about that all the time when I think about some of the things that adults push back on. Often when I'm training folks, I try to help them understand the experience by waiting until there's a break. Everybody's left the room, and I'll take all of their materials and belongings and I'll move them from one seat to the other. And it's amazing how angry people get by that one little shift in their world. But I think it does help to put into perspective for people that some of the behaviors that they see as challenges are really just our children trying to find a way to survive in a world that keeps changing on them without their input, without their permission. I think the second thing is absolutely to use child first language. I know because we're parents who live with this all the time, and even for many professionals as well, we live with the issues that our children are trying to balance. We live with the challenges that we have as parents to do the best job that we can. And we oftentimes take shortcuts in our language just because it feels familiar. So I've heard People refer to their rad children. Well, children aren't rad. Children are Susie and Kia and Damone. They may have an attachment difficulty as a result of their experience. But we always want to use child first language. We want to talk all the time about what it means to be a family. What are the benefits? What are the privileges of having family membership? And the fact that those benefits and privileges really are considered rights unless you've been denied them. And as we talk about family, we also want to understand, recognize, and elevate the fact that family means different things to different people. So, especially for young people who may have been in institutionalized care, whether that's a group home or that's an intensive residential treatment center or wherever, family feels different. Family is someplace over here, and maybe they've created family among their friends or among their cohorts. So we want to also talk about family in an expansive way. When we're talking about older youth who have maybe aged out and are continuing to find their way, they often have created their own family in piecemeal out of the folks in their life that they've come to trust. And then finally, think about how any child or any person that you're talking about in order to make your advocacy point would feel if they heard or read the story the way that you are telling it. If you wouldn't feel comfortable saying what you're saying in front of them or to them, then you should not be saying it to other people. You really want to be respectful and be thoughtful about how you speak and how you write.
I also want to just add to a few points that Kim was making. The way that we describe young people, even some of the nonverbal ways in which we interact with them, really dictate the quality of how they interact with themselves. Counter to, I think, what a lot of people would imagine to be solutions for working with more troubling youth, one of the recommendations I have for people that are really struggling with someone in a classroom setting or an advocacy setting, if that young person is often pulling attention to themselves and distracting away from just what you're trying to get done, one of the techniques that you can use instead of chastising them or pulling them away from the attention, which is obviously what they're craving, is to instead put them in a leadership role. And I get some eye rolls at this, but you would honestly be amazed at how often this works. During my trainings, if I have a young person that is, especially if they're doing behavior which is engaging other people's attention towards them, giving them a task and really communicating to them reasons why you think they will do it well, you would be amazed how often young people are always just trying to live up to the framework in the box that you are creating with your actions and your words towards them. So again, being mindful, being mindful of your descriptors, being mindful of your subtle body language, those expectations set a precedent for that young person and how they expect to hold themselves accountable in your presence. And so always set the bar higher than you want to.
Great advice. And I have seen the same thing work. So I agree with you, Kayla. That's exactly the right approach. So other support that you can offer to your advocates, it's to give them some tips, give them some specifics about how to go about sharing their story, creating their story. Help people to understand that they want to keep it very simple and descriptive and to the point, and not to go diving into too much detail. One of the things that we see is that the more detail that folks tend to include in their story, the more it takes them off track, and they end up going on these winding roads and kind of miss what the key point is. Journalists are always told, don't bury the lead. Whatever you do, do not bury the lead. So we want to help people figure out how to take that lead, that most important point, keep it front and center, and as politicians can do all the time, bring it back to that all the time. That is your lead. And when we talked earlier about the fact that there may be 3 or 5 different speakers on a topic, but that each one of them will have a different point to make, again, as they practice, help them learn to bring it back to their lead. So there's going to be 3 to 5 different leads. Each one of those panelists is going to bring it back to theirs. Help them think about how to make connections between their own story and what others might have presented, so that you're really painting a full and complete picture and helping folks figure out how to connect the dots. And in addition, try to make the connections between your story and the folks in the audience. So I will always tell people, if you're going to be speaking with people, first of all, see if you can't get a little barometer of who's in the room. If I'm doing a presentation, I may ask, how many are foster parents? How many are adoptive parents? How many people experienced time in care? So that I know that I can look at those folks and try to see how they're responding to what I'm saying. Are they nodding their heads? Am I making the right points? Am I on target or am I drifting? And especially never, ever, ever, ever make personal attacks. We work with people to remember not to use anyone's names, not to reveal anything that shouldn't be revealed. In fact, the only time that I am okay with somebody using somebody's name that has not given them permission is when they want to elevate great work or a great a great effort. I've often heard young people talk about that one social worker who was amazing among all others. And in that case, sure, you want to compliment someone, go ahead and use a name. But as far as personal attacks, the other piece of the personal attacks is that they don't work. Even if they are systemic attacks, they don't work. What you want to do instead, and where I will redirect folks, adults and youth alike, is to think about whatever that negative is that you need to get out there and get expressed, and instead talk about what would be the best practice. How would I do it if I was in this role? It's a wonderful way to make sure that you're not going to get off point. And it's also a great way to make sure you're not going to alienate your audience. I'm going to skip the debrief because I'm going to turn that piece over to Kayla. She does a great job with how she debriefs folks. But then finally, I do want to always help folks make sure they take notes and that they practice. People should not be reading in front of an audience if at all possible. But for myself, especially again when I'm working with young people or if I'm working with adults that are really nervous, I'll tell them, let me be your secretary. You tell me your story. I'll type it up for you while you're talking so I can keep track of it. And then I will give it to you to look at it and make sure I got it right and to figure out what pieces you want to use. Kayla?
All right, so the debrief is actually, again, another one of these essential strategic sharing tips. Often with your advocates, you want to create an expected system of actions, procedures, and protocols. And the debrief is incredibly important. Sharing our stories, engaging with the emotions associated with the details of our lives. It's incredibly emotional. We need time to process that. And so something that I always structurally include within my trainings, especially if I'm going to be doing a panel or if I'm going to be having young people share their story as part of a workshop curriculum that we're doing, is let them know that we're going to do a debrief at the end. And the debrief actually serves a number of different functions. One, it's a way for kind of giving them some feedback on how well they did and the things that they can improve on, but also gives them a chance to kind of process the emotions associated with sharing and to de-escalate some of those feelings. And when you do that, it's actually incredibly sustaining to keep these people involved with your work, because again, if people start associating the act of sharing with so much emotional distress that they have to carry on throughout the rest of their time, they're not necessarily going to want to re-engage with you. And so I really try to focus with advocates on talking through the emotions, trying to pull positives out of that experience and letting them know that they're supported in case there's more that they need to work through with me. And a note on giving feedback. I think we're running out of time, but I'm going to give this one really quickly because it's very important. Nobody becomes a very successful advocate without feedback. I'm going to go into a little bit my own personal journey if we have time, but the idea behind the compliment sandwich is to package feedback in such a way that people are going to be receptive to it without taking it so personally that they are disenfranchised from being involved ever again. One of the ways that you can make people more receptive to feedback is essentially setting up a system in which they anticipate feedback regardless of how well or poorly that they did. So when I used to do youth trainings where I would do training of trainers, I would make sure that everyone knew to expect that as part of our debrief, part of that emotional conversation about how they were feeling, I was also going to be giving them feedback. I was going to be giving them some feedback on what they did very well as something I think they could improve on. And no matter how well someone did, I always managed to find something that I could critique as a way of them furthering their skills, just so that other young people did not feel singled out, also because everyone has something to improve on. So again, for those of you unfamiliar with it, the idea of the compliment sandwich is to start with something that they did well. Insert something that they could improve on, something that you think could have gone in a different direction, have a conversation about it, and then again end on a positive note by giving them another compliment. This not only reinforces what they did well so that they can keep repeating these actions and they're aware that that was a positive thing, it allows them to not take the criticism so personally. It allows them to see it as a development tool as opposed to a personal attack. All right, I'm going to try to be considerate to time in case anyone has any questions. We're going to go back to the idea of feedback here really quickly. And again, feedback is so incredibly hard for everyone to take. The thing that you have to understand and the conversation that you need to have with advocates is that nobody's at the top of their game just when they're starting off. I remember when I was involved with Foster Club, and I was surrounded by these incredible advocates all the time. Lupe Tovar, Nicole Dobbins, people that were just kind of continuously rising into these leadership positions. And I thought to myself, I'm never going to be like that. The first time I ever tried to do any level of public speaking was when I was student council president. I stood up to do my announcements with all the confidence in the world, and I ended up shaking so badly that I could barely get out any of the words from my mouth. And I thought in that moment, I'm just not a person that can do public speaking. I'm not a person that should be in the spotlight. I bet I'm a background person. And we really need to steer people away from this idea, because everyone that you've seen in these positions had to start somewhere. People with natural skill, ability in music and sports and music, at some point you're going to plateau. And at that point is when the real effort and the real promoting of the skills that you have and building on those skills needs to come into play. And so again, really implementing feedback, positive feedback, points of growth for young people and for other advocates is really important. We want to have a spectrum of people being engaged, not just the people that have natural ability for public speaking and those types of engagements. And so as part of this feedback, sometimes it can be really important to kind of highlight our own journeys in that regard, just to make sure that young people know this isn't something that you're either born into or you should stay away from. Similar to Kim's point, when young people are in doubt or when they're having challenges with their stories, again, we really like to promote the idea of keeping it simple and to the point. Spiraling into our emotions or the details of a story can be so distracting to the point that we actually get off what we're trying to communicate and what we're trying to actually exemplify with our stories. So really promoting that in the kinds of feedback that we give to advocates. Also, the idea of remembering that your audience might not understand the culture of foster care and adoption. There's a lot that we take for granted in regards to what we assume people must know about it, that sometimes we ourselves need a little bit of training in regards to understanding the differences between our own experiences versus those of potential change makers like legislators. And lastly, we communicated a little bit of this before, but the idea of celebrating successes. Oftentimes, it can be really challenging for people to hear the difficulties of our stories. Sometimes change makers can feel personally attacked. And so not only being solutions focused, but also kind of highlighting the things that worked within the programs and the services that were provided to you can do a lot in sustaining those things, and also kind of giving a saving grace silver lining to the issue so that it's not alienating for your audience to listen to.
So finally, as you're giving tips, as you're giving feedback, remember to be strengths-based and highlight what worked well more than what needs to change. I always like to start with what did work really well. And like Kayla had said around the sandwich, do that piece where you can start and end with what's really going well. Find out, especially when there's something that perhaps you thought didn't belong there, find out why a particular item was important to the storyteller, so that you can understand why they included it. And if it was not appropriate or if it was not hitting the mark, help them figure out another way to make that same point. That's really your role as the facilitator. Our role is to make sure that our storytellers are 100% successful 100% of the time. I know that it's probably not going to happen that way, but that's what we have to shoot for. And that is our responsibility when we invite people to share their story. Um, as we said several different times, think about how they can share private information in a way that can be used both harmfully and not harmfully, and that will help build their skills in terms of protecting themselves, taking their skills out of strict survival mode and bringing them into really proactive protection and growth mode. And then talk together as a group. We often will prepare young people and parents alike for any kind of an advocacy effort. We prepare people together so that they will be able to together reframe things and offer feedback, and it's not just on one person. And I will say one of the most important things that I think we have to remember is that our number one role is not to cause additional harm. We have got to be sure that we are doing everything in our power to make sure that those people who are brave enough and willing to get up there and generous enough to share a piece of themselves to help make our systems better for someone else are absolutely protected to the best of our ability. That is a huge undertaking and a huge, huge gift of generosity. At the same time, I know that the personal storytelling can absolutely change the world. It can make people think about things in a new way. It can make people change the way they do their practice. I can tell you very briefly, my daughter was speaking at a panel in front of judges and talked about her adoption experience as compared to her brother's adoption experience, not knowing that the two judges she was speaking of, one positively and one negatively, were sitting right there in the room next to one another. And both came up to her afterwards and both talked to her about how they were going to change their practice based on what she had to say. So there are two well established circuit judges who are telling a 14-year-old girl, your words have changed my practice. That's powerful stuff. And we really want to encourage you to continue to go forward as advocates. Reach out to Kayla and myself. You will be getting a follow-up email. I will attach the links to some of the resources that Kayla mentioned, and you will also have both her and my email addresses to reach back out to us again. Kayla,
I want
any final words?
Yes, I want to do a little bit of a plug. So for those of you who are having initiatives that you want to engage young people on and you're looking for a diversity of experience, NACAC actually has a youth advisory team of former foster and adoptive youth who have had extensive advocacy and leadership training. And you can use these young people as part of your services, and you can solicit their involvement in some of the projects that you're doing. If you have a panel, if you have a training that you're interested in hosting, if you have any opportunity for young people to get involved and you're looking for more young people to do that already have experience and are prepared, this is an opportunity that we can offer you as a resource. And you can either email me or request these services through our technical assistance link.
I just want to thank Madison for her kind words about the webinar. And as I said to her, I will say to all of you, reiterating Kayla's point, we're here to help you. You can also find lots and lots of resources on the NACAC website, which is www.nacac.org. Thanks, folks, and have a wonderful day.